Hello, my name is Michelle Zabel and my pronouns are she and her. I'm an assistant dean at the University of Maryland School of Social Work and the proud director of the Institute for Innovation and Implementation. Today, I'm just delighted to welcome you to this Training Institute live workshop. As you might have come to expect with all your favorite conferences, the Training Institutes are now virtual. And although I know we'd all like to be together in person, we are excited to host the Virtual Training Institutes and really want to encourage you to continue to join us on the first Thursday of every month through August. Each month, you'll have a choice of 2 back-to-back workshops. So mark your calendars, choose your workshops, and make sure you reserve your place early so that you can attend the workshop that most interests you. Today, I want to encourage you to actively participate by using the chat to post your questions, post your comments, and share your resources with your colleagues. Our presenters, they definitely want to hear from you. And it is absolutely your participation that will make each of these sessions a success. As a reminder, staff are monitoring the chat and they're going to make sure the facilitators see your questions and comments, so be sure and engage. A few other reminders to include: if you need assistance at any time navigating through these virtual spaces or accessing links to workshops, we do have a live help desk support standing by to assist. We are also providing a certificate of attendance after the completion of each workshop, and all of our workshops are being recorded, so by you participating, you're implying consent. Finally, an ASL interpreter will be present during each session. The interpreters can be pinned for those who require interpretation by hovering over the interpreter's video and selecting the 3 dots. One of the options that will appear is pin video. By selecting the pin video, this video will not move out of view. Following the workshop, we will have a wellness and mindfulness break with guided activities before our second afternoon session. With our theme, What Could Be? Bolder Systems and Brighter Futures for Children, Youth, Young Adults, and Their Families, all of our sessions will challenge us to envision a future where the voices of children, youth, young adults, and their families are elevated, especially those who are most frequently silenced or marginalized, where we use the best data and research available to challenge ourselves, developing new ideas and approaches that can be implemented to meet the needs of youth and families, and in service of our commitment to social justice and the elimination of disproportionality and disparities. My hope is that today's session will provide you with food for thought as you consider your next steps in creating a vibrant, equitable future for youth with complex needs and their families. Please don't forget to register for next month's workshop. Remember, they're held the first Thursday of every month, and you can visit the institute.umaryland.edu for the full schedule. Thank you so much for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you next month.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome. Before I begin, I want to thank everyone at the University of Maryland, Baltimore for inviting us to participate in the kickoff to the Training Institute series for 2021. I'm Linda Callejas. My colleague Selena Webster Bass is presenting with me today. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I'm going to go ahead and get started. During this discussion, Selena and I will start with a provocation that challenges our current uses of the term implicit bias and how this concept is used for framing racism in practice. 2020 was a devastating year for many of us, and 2021 appears to be continuing apace in many ways. And as we process this historical moment, I ask that we engage in this critique to better understand how racism operates and reduces the quality of life for Black people in particular, and by extension, all of us in this country. So the reframing of implicit bias that we reference in the title of this presentation is informed by interdisciplinary research on racism as a social process, rather than one that resides within individuals. Mm-hmm. And once I review the concept and discuss its limitations, Selena will discuss the mental health effects of racism on African American communities and individuals, followed by some organizational and community-focused approaches to addressing some of the inequities that I'll touch on. So before we begin, we thought we would start with a quick poll to give us all a sense of where we are. So if you could, please respond to the first poll question by answering yes or no, and then we have a follow-up question. How did implicit bias training influence your work, if you did have that training? So we'll just take a few minutes. The poll is up. And I'm not sure if I see any responses yet, but if someone could highlight those. Do you see some of those, Selena?
Yes, increased awareness to view all situations through multiple lenses. One respondent has not participated in a training before, greater awareness of implicit and explicit racism. So more comfortable talking about race and equity.
Great. Thank you. So it sounds like we have quite a few folks that have had this sort of training. So let's begin by reviewing this definition of implicit bias that has been used quite a bit, especially in trainings that are given nationwide. This is from the Kirwan Institute, and it reads, also known as implicit social cognition, implicit bias refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. Residing deep in the subconscious, these biases are different from known biases and are not accessible through introspection. So as you can see, this definition is somewhat dated, but it also asks us or shapes thinking about implicit bias that remains quite prevalent today, especially in behavioral health, in the behavioral health field. And if we think about the way that this term has been used in the media and in our everyday lives, the phrases here that I want to highlight: unconscious manner, subconscious manner, and not accessible through introspection, emphasize implicit bias as a process that is unconscious and or involuntary. It's unknown for some individuals. It just is sort of there, but people don't know it's there until it rears its head, or that it's out of reach for some of us, right? So if we think about that phrase, inaccessible through introspection, this suggests that even if we try to reflect on or examine our own thoughts, ideas, attitudes about racism and particular racial groups, we may not be able to access those ideas. What implications does this have for how we work to combat or intervene against racism and its effects on people's well-being? So let's examine this point further. If we take this and similar definitions of implicit bias at face value, the first thing that we can see is that biases are thought to be psychological processes at their base, right? A process that is internal for individuals. And so the focus goes to that internal, individual, interpersonal type of practice. So this suggests that there's a cognitive, educational, or other limitations on the part of individuals who engage in racist practice. If we're building on this discussion, then this internal process is seen as being cloudy at best, right? But nevertheless, the way that implicit bias is widely used suggests that even though we don't know what's happening in the unconscious, it predicts behavior in ways that can be out of people's control. So that has implications for how we think about our practices and our behaviors and how we interact with others, right? Although researchers have tried to measure these biases and theorize about how they result in racist behaviors, we still find a great deal of contention about this point in particular, right? So how many of us I think we can do a show of hands on Zoom, but how many of us, or you can just say in the chat, have taken the implicit association test? I have. It's hard for me to see the chat the way I have everything set up. So do you see it, Selena?
Combination of yes and no's.
Okay, so the implicit association test was developed by researchers at Harvard in 1998 to test individual attitudes or beliefs by measuring the subconscious associations that individuals make between concepts, right? So the basic premise of the test is that when you take this test on the computer, you're asked to quickly associate concepts such as male or female, or as in the picture that we're showing here, African American or European American, and then with attributes associated with judgments, such as good or bad and pleasurable or unpleasurable. And you've got to pick pretty quickly as these images come through on your screen. Because the judgments are made quickly, researchers thought that the test might accurately capture these unconscious or subconscious attitudes that individuals are often unwilling to share publicly with others. Further, they hypothesized that socially dominant groups would, find more negative associations with groups that are societally identified as other or minoritized, right, groups, and individuals would show preference for their own group. So the original publication introducing the implicit association test has been widely cited. And as the training on implicit bias has grown, it's been used as a foundation for some of those trainings. However, there is a growing body of research that has questioned the test's ability to accurately capture the hidden or unconscious biased impulses in individuals, and its abilities, really, the critique is to predict behavior and racist behavior in particular. So one of the most widely known critiques of the concept, or one of the most widely cited, is a book by the legal scholar Jonathan Cahn, titled Race on the Brain, What Implicit Bias Gets Wrong About the Struggle for Racial Justice. And the book his work highlights how legal rulings have really codified this idea that racism is situated within individuals who have intent to harm others or discriminate against others. So that really shapes the way in legal decisions that racial discrimination is decided upon, but it also has shaped, that discourse has shaped the way we think about it in other domains. Kahn's work engages closely with that of sociologist Ruha Benjamin, and in particular, her book, Race After Technology, Abolitionist Tools for the New Jim Code. That book details how emerging digital technologies perpetuate white supremacy by making it seem that the technologies themselves and the way they operate is neutral. However, race gets coded in there. And that process of coding for our purposes is important because it shows us how ideas about racial inferiority can be hidden, but they're not unconscious, and they're used to justify a common sense about particular groups, and in this discussion about Black people in particular. So the focus on the unconscious nature of the implicit bias concept diverts our attention away from the broader structural nature of racism, and that interpersonal racism, and the fact that interpersonal racism rather is an outgrowth of that structure. So before we examine the various aspects of racism, let's define terms. Race in this country is a ubiquitous or pervasive concept that shapes all of our social lives, whether we choose to recognize it or not, or whether we're able to see it or not, as a conscious thing. And it's also a foundational one in many ways, despite arguments to the contrary. A straightforward definition for race is that it's a hierarchical system of classification which holds that there are innate, hereditary, or cultural differences that separate human species into distinct subgroups, and that those subgroups are associated with a presence or the absence of social attributes such as intelligence or criminality, for instance, right? So we move from that term to racism, which is a system under which this classification of race was developed to facilitate and justify, in our case, in the Americas, the entire Western Hemisphere, the Atlantic slave trade, and the conquest of lands of people outside of Europe through settler colonialism. So this system, although it remains pervasive, has changed over time to accommodate changing conditions, changing socio-historical conditions in various parts of the Western Hemisphere. And we continue to see these effects in the United States today. So we move to this discussion on, levels of racism, which theorists, researchers, social scientists from a variety of different disciplines have used in various ways. And oftentimes today we hear structural and systemic racism used interchangeably. Although some writers really define these terms distinctly depending on the discipline. So I just want to focus mostly on this slide on the definition of structural racism, and I include the definition taken from sociologist Bonilla Silva, whose work builds on prior work that's been done in this area since the 1960s, right? So these are not new ideas. They've been with us for quite a long time because these problems have been with us for quite a long time. So structural racism is defined as the macro level systems, social forces, institutions, ideologies, and processes that interact with one another to generate and reinforce inequities among racial and ethnic groups. So you can see that this definition, Bonilla Silva's definition, which I use, includes systems, right, and institutions. This theory of his, when he sets this theory forth in sociology, it's really concerned more with the broader structure of society and how it replicates, but is able to change over time to accommodate new technologies, new ways of being. And therefore, it shapes the institutions and the systems which then set policy and practice, and thus shape individual behaviors. So racism at the individual level, or interpersonal racism as listed here, is understood within that theory as being part of a series of, it's part of a collective process. It's a part of a social interaction. The fact that a thought, exists in someone's head doesn't have implications for others until it's part of that social process or relationships. The main takeaway here is that racism, operates at various levels as part of a broader structure, It's endemic to our society, and it produces as a natural byproduct a number of health and other disparities, or more precisely, inequitable outcomes, as a natural byproduct of its existence and continued existence over time. So we therefore move from really thinking about implicit bias as an unconscious process to one that, let me back up a second. I want to just emphasize that the science of the unconscious mind is still an area of considerable debate. So this process of moving from implicit bias as an unconscious process to one that really forces us to think about the multiple ways that racial discrimination is put into practice, and the ways that individuals are situated within systems, institutions, and structures is more useful to really understanding where we are today as a society. So now we're going to watch a video to further clarify some of these points, and we'll end the video. It's about 8 minutes, maybe it's 7 minutes. And at the end, we're going to ask you to share your thoughts in the chat about what resonates the most.
And now, through the use of a National Housing Act insured mortgage, is brought within the reach of all citizens on a monthly payment.
In the midst of the New Deal, when the FDR administration is looking for ways to try to stabilize the housing market, the Fair Housing Act is passed in 1934. And as part of that, the Homeowners Loan Corporation is also established, with the hope that if you could establish long-term mortgages with fixed interest rates, you could create pathways to homeownership for most Americans.
This time they can buy this house with monthly payments that are less than they now spend for rent.
When the FHA starts underwriting mortgages in the 1930s, this really is a game changer in a lot of ways. It takes a lot of risk off the banks, it places it onto the federal government, and now working class, middle class families, they're able to purchase a home.
Unfortunately, as part of that, what the HOLC does is it establishes designations for neighborhoods based on the occupants of those neighborhoods.
And this is where the term redlining comes into place. The FHA, they made color-coded maps of all the largest cities in the United States, and they broke cities down into 4 different areas. Red is considered hazardous, that's the worst. Yellow is considered definitely declining. Blue is considered still desirable, and green is considered the best.
And what's so powerful about this kind of scale of measuring investment, it was about values and people.
The fact of the matter is that there was no evidence that those people who lived in those communities, predominantly black and brown people and foreign-born people, would have defaulted on loans.
There are no firm realities behind the close proximity to blackness and your property values going down. That's just not true.
The FHA is being very upfront and very explicit in how they are linking spatial desirability with racial occupancy. It's this racialization of space idea. So areas that were predominantly African-American or majority minority, or really, in a lot of cases, even if there's a few non-white people there, that's often enough to be redlined. So when they built these maps, they also explained why each area got the ranking it did.
The area around 4th Avenue South, which is called the Old South Side. This was a nice area, it had nice homes. It's the historic African-American neighborhood on the south side of Minneapolis.
This one part of South Minneapolis was redlined specifically due to, and I'm quoting, a gradual infiltration of Negroes and Asiatics. The FHA refused to give an area a green-lined designation. Again, this is the best designation that they'll offer unless, and I'm quoting again, restrictive covenants are already in place. That line's from the FHA underwriting manual. Racial covenants aren't just about discriminating against people of color. It's about enriching white people. And I think that's the part that often gets lost in this narrative. And I think it does speak to the ways that white supremacy have been embedded in really built structures and built environments. I mean, if your grandparents bought a home on Minnehaha Creek, that home's worth, what, $500,000? If your grandparents rented an area that was redlined and then subsequently destroyed by a freeway project, you're not inheriting anything.
in a lot of ways, the practice of redlining, which didn't start until the 1930s, institutionalized and spread racial covenants all over the country because suddenly developers got sanction, they got direction from the federal government saying, this is best practices if you want to have a really high rating from us, if you want to get the most favorable terms for any loans.
By kind of de-integrating Minneapolis, which in many ways is what racial covenants are doing, this set the stage and enabled all these subsequent systems of inequality to really take hold.
This very persistent myth that northern cities never had formal segregation. The South had Jim Crow, and look at those signs. Well, racial covenants did the work of Jim Crow in the North, all over the North.
Many, many whites simply were not aware that there was a segregation. So many people in Minneapolis would be outraged what they thought that their friend was being discriminated against. They knew something was happening, but it wasn't happening to your friend. That was what kind of this mixed kind of a situation that we had in Minneapolis. I mean, if you could imagine these people, their parents sent me cookies and, cakes all during the war. And I was welcome in their house. There was no question about it. And then there's other people who were just absolutely Klansmen. That was what Minneapolis was all about. But that was my generation in Minneapolis. We were hemmed in that ghetto, and that was our life. That was our world.
The 1935 land use planning map used to define which place would get mortgages versus others circled these areas, called them slums, places where the quote-unquote Negroes lived. These are places to avoid, right? So they're gonna give you substandard housing and they're gonna contain you. Access to affordable housing was a challenge. When you think about the reasons behind the creation of public housing, we had a lot of folks forced to the low-wage sector, right? And you're thinking about what jobs or opportunities that low-income folks of color even had access to at this time. I would argue that with the creation of public housing in 1938, with the Sumner Field homes, became this really interesting iteration of the redesign of space. You have 400 units of public housing, which were segregated at the time, created. In 1953, the City Council of Minneapolis refused to scatter another 1,000 units of public housing outside of the Sumner Field homes area. And where did these pressures come from? You had both internal conservative politicians and outlying suburban communities coming in saying, not in my neighborhood. And the City Council crumbled under the pressure and then took what was 400 units of public housing to over 1,000 units in less than a decade. They have strategically manufactured urban poverty.
This history is very personal for me. I'm a third-generation Minneapolitan. My grandparents were immigrants from Sweden who came to this country with nothing, worked incredibly hard jobs, but both sets of my grandparents in 1942 were able to buy houses in South Minneapolis. These houses were in a part of the city that was blanketed by racial covenants. Because of those racial covenants, my parents grew up in neighborhoods that were entirely white. And in many ways, they described them as a paradise for children. They had wonderful parks. They had really solid schools that sent them to college. But no one in their neighborhood ever talked about the fact that this neighborhood was only for white people. And I want everyone with this map to imagine themselves in this landscape of privilege and disenfranchisement.
Sorry, I was muted. That is a video that is very powerful in what it presents. And I know that various folks had begun posting to the chat, which I immediately lost for some reason. But we're hoping to get some of your feedback about what resonated with you most from the video. I saw some responses about it being infuriating, about highlighting discrimination, and how certain neighborhoods become brownfields or places where toxic waste and other wastes are dumped. Selena, could you help me with any other responses that might be on the chat? And I will also share at the end, or once I stop presenting, because it makes it hard for me to see the chat, the link to the documentary clip.
Very powerful and infuriating, but an important discussion. Overt and covert racism comes to mind as well. The video highlights how we socially construct racism in our communities. The federal government spearheaded it.
Yeah.
These districts are easy to see in so many cities today. Communities still struggle, brown and Black people, from things I've read in history and politics. The chat is moving very quickly.
Okay, well, we'll do, in the interest of time, I'll keep going, but I'll circle back to this while Selena's presenting, so we have time for the Q&A at the end and touch back on some of this. So thank you everyone for sharing. It is powerful, it is disturbing, and it demonstrates that we often use ways of thinking about what's happening. We might compartmentalize it. Oh, that was something in the past, or that was something in the South. And as the video makes clear, this is in Minnesota and Minneapolis. And the other thing I want to highlight from that is that the racial covenants, as they said, don't come into play until the 1930s. So as we see in the video, these issues like segregation, coupled with these very explicit efforts to characterize Black peoples in particular ways, did not and have not remained back in slavery days, right? They are very much present with us, and there are these official practices then shape the way people's attitudes and opinions. So using this slide, when we talk about historical trauma, I think it's critical for us coming off of this video to note that the negative effects of racial discrimination are reinforced in younger generations, right? Because they also experience discrimination and marginalization, even if those experiences are qualitatively different from what their parents, grandparents, and other ancestors experienced. On the other hand, some of these experiences are strikingly similar. So we have to, reckon with that. When we talk about historical trauma, a lot of times we think about it as something in the past that's sort of shared through genes and or people's stories, but they're very much also reinforced by current day practices. And just in closing, I want to, of this, of the video and what we've seen, I wanted to highlight the work of Dr. Lawrence Brown, who used to be at Morgan State, I believe. So if you're from Baltimore, you really know that originally redlined neighborhoods continue to be segregated and have, as a result, high rates of policing and incarceration. Dr. Brown's work, he's just put out a book called The Black Butterfly, The Politics of Race and Space in America. And it takes up this discussion that we've sort of highlighted with this video clip, where he details how local officials in Baltimore and city elites use regulatory policies and legislation to enact segregation. And those policies and regulations were supported by newspapers and other media outlets, thus spreading the ideas about Black criminality, inferiority, and the need to control these populations in these ghettos, so to speak, right? So he ties this to all of this history in Baltimore to the historical trauma and the experiences of residents of the neighborhoods in the present day. So I recommend the book highly. Now, the next few slides, I'm going to go a little bit quickly. I think I'm not exactly sure how much time I have left, but these present various examples of what sociologists, what Bonilla Silva in his theory of structural racism, anthropologists, and other social scientists recognize as the consequences of racism. So many of us are probably familiar with some of the information on this particular slide, and the next couple of slides, they have to do with increasing rates of serious mental illness among African-American young adults 18 to 25, and show that a majority of this group do not get treatment for their conditions. We see some increases in major depressive episodes and again, with severe impairment. One of the things that we also see is that suicidal thoughts, planning, and attempts are also rising, particularly in young adults. Young adult African Americans. And while they're still lower than the overall US population rates, this is concerning and has concerned a number of researchers in this area. Here we see inequities in our education system, specifically with regard to suspensions and more punitive disciplinary actions for Black students. On the left, you can see the stark differences that Black and white school-age students experience at the national level. And on the right, you'll note that these differences begin as early as preschool. And the differences that are highlighted on this particular slide have been shown to contribute to what a number of researchers have documented as the school to prison pipeline. This slide shows disparities in foster care, an area of research that I'm currently working in. And the blue bar shows rates in foster care as compared to the orange or red bar, which shows the representative share of each racial ethnic group in this country. It highlights the disproportionate rates of child removal among Black American children, Native American children, and mixed race children. And these persistent disparities have been recognized by numerous researchers as legacies of slavery and dispossession on the part of indigenous peoples, in particular in these lands now recognized as the United States. So here we have some figures that show the disproportionate incarceration of Black Americans in particular. You can see on the left just how high that rate is. Overall, Black Americans are incarcerated at a rate that is 5.1 times that of whites. Black men have the highest rates of likelihood of being killed in a police encounter, although you see disparities also among Black women, Native men, Native women, and Latinx men. I just want to make a quick note. I didn't have time to really include this information on the slide, but I came across a newspaper article very recently that shows that the sheriff's office in Pasco, Florida, which is close to Tampa, where I work, has established a list of school-age children who have been abused or performed poorly at school and that they characterize as likely to fall into a life of crime at some point in the future, and thus are tracking those children. Officials confirmed to the Tampa Bay Times that there are currently 420 children on that list, and that officers have been instructed to visit those homes repeatedly to look for reasons to arrest those students and or family members to write tickets, right? So, I mean, this article really took my breath away because I was working on this presentation, notwithstanding the fact that at one point in my own academic trajectory, I might have been on that list. But really, I think that it is a prime example of how discrimination operates in ways that maybe the general public doesn't see or makes it difficult for people to see. But without someone like a newspaper or a journalist raising awareness about it, but that these practices are codified by official policies and practices, right? And those practices then shape what individuals think and how they operate. So finally, as I close my portion of the presentation and turn things over to Selena, I just want to highlight this figure by Ruth Shim and colleagues, which highlights the social determinants of mental health and the importance really of keeping our eyes on the root causes, which are pointed at with these arrows here. Those root causes shape the social determinants of mental health and health, right? Anthropologists like Emily Yates Doerr and others have called on us to critically examine how we think about the social determinants and understand them as elements that are shaped by these larger structural, often hidden processes, structures like racial segregation and discrimination. Here it's titled Longstanding Historical and Social Cultural Context in the US, which intersects with the ways that we organize our economic systems. We often think about the social determinants of health as the causes of people's well-being or lack thereof, but rather this new work is really calling on us to really understand them as indicators of these broader structures that I've tried to highlight here today. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Selena and I'll monitor the chat. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Linda, for just helping us to reframe our thinking about implicit bias and systemic inequities. So in my section, I will address the emotional and psychological injury that negatively impacts the mental health of African Americans and communities of color as a result of racism and discriminatory events. And I think it's important to provide some contemporary context in terms of where we are as a nation in terms of racism and structural inequities. And so we are experiencing a pandemic within a pandemic. We're at 23 million cases of COVID-19, nearly 400,000 deaths. And we know that COVID-19 has amplified existing inequities in terms of our health, social, and economic systems. COVID-19 is compounded by the incidents, the killings of unarmed African Americans by law enforcement. And during this time of civil unrest and community mourning around the deaths of Sandra Bland, Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Walter Wallace, and so many others, it's important that we really re-examine the way that we are addressing inequities in our society. And I would be remiss if I did not mention last week, just January 6th, last week we vicariously witnessed an insurrection on the Capitol. Legislators were targeted with violence, an attack on our democracy and the electoral process, Confederate flags being carried through the Capitol halls. We saw images of police officers helping insurrectionists down the stairs after they were dismissed from the Capitol. And so again, communities of color are re-triggered because there are disparities in how law enforcement has reacted on Wednesday as in comparison to the time during civil unrest with the protests. And so, I really think it's important that we, for the sake of our children, the legacy of our children, that we ask ourselves, what are we doing to address racial hierarchies in our society? What are we doing to end white supremacy in our country? And so there is something that's transformational about experiencing our events through the lens of a child. And so I'd like to show you a video of Kedron Bryant. Kedron is from Jacksonville, Florida, and he composed this vocal performance in response to the George Floyd incident. And I'd like for you to just think about what comes to mind, like what adjectives come to mind as you listen to Kedron's performance. And so, Allison, if you could show the video.
I'm a young black man doing all that I can to stand. Oh, but when I look around and I see what's being done to my kind, every day I'm being hunted as prey. My people don't want no trouble. We've had enough struggle. I just wanna live. God protect me. I just wanna live. I just wanna live.
And so we like to just take a moment and just let that settle for just a moment. It's such a compelling video. Vocal performance. And so we'd like for you to respond in the form of a word cloud, your response to Keydrawn's performance. And Allison will give us some instructions here.
I just posted some instructions in the chat box, but they'll also be on the screen. You can go to menti.com and you will use that code 6276367 to enter your response.
Thank you, Allison. And I see that there are some responses in the chat box. I'll try to catch them. Very powerful. Mixed emotions, intense, real, sad, breathtaking, haunting, raw, vulnerable, truthful, chills, painful, beautiful, soulful, devastating, understandable, touching, breathtaking, clear, moving. Thank you so much for your participation in our word cloud. And I'd like you to just take a snapshot of that word cloud, help you remember our presentation today to carry along some of the concepts that we'll share. Thank you, Allison. So one of the things that's really compelling about Keydrawn's performance for me is the duality of his performance. You know, we heard hope because he didn't say he wanted to die. He said he wanted to live. So we heard resilience in Keydrawn's performance. And we also heard despair. I think one of the lyrics that really resonates with me in his performance is hunted like prey. But the thing that really stood out for me in terms of this song is that Keydrawn was able to name his pain, that he gave the pain a name, that he gave his racial stress and trauma a name. He was able to affix words to his experience. And so I think that's really important as we work with young people and families that are experiencing racial stress and trauma, that we create spaces for young people to talk about what they are experiencing. So oftentimes when we think about adverse childhood experiences, we focus on, of course, the ACEs study, Felidi's work, the CDC Kaiser Permanente study. This study covered three major categories: abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. And so the pyramid on my left shows how our adverse childhood experiences impact our lifespan, across the lifespan, from increased risk for heart disease, asthma, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, kidney disease, and the list goes on. But we see on the other side of our slide here, we see that there are two additional layers that are added to the pyramid here. So we see social conditions, the local context, the generational embodiment and the historical trauma that Linda mentioned earlier as factors that also impact the experiences of children, youth, and families as well. And so it's important that we consider the socio-ecological facets of adverse childhood experiences and consider how that impacts health outcomes in children, youth, and families. So one of the studies that supports this idea of social location and historical trauma is the Philadelphia ACEs study that expanded the categories of ACEs beyond just childhood abuse, neglect, and dysfunction. It expanded ACEs to include community violence, bullying, neighborhood safety, living in foster care, as well as racism. And so what this study shows is the importance of addressing trauma, not only at the interpersonal level across those traditional domains that we mentioned, but also considering the historical context, considering discrimination and racism as well as part of the experiences, the everyday experiences of people of color. So how do we define racial stress and trauma? It's categorized by dangerous race-based events. These are stressors, discrimination that overwhelm the coping capacity, and it impacts the quality of life, causing fear, a sense of hopelessness, and also horror. And we know that racial discrimination is consistently linked to poor physical and mental health outcomes across racial groups, and that these discriminatory experiences are a threat to the integrity and to the safety of individuals who experience racial stress and trauma. Racial stress and trauma may be connected to an individual experience, or it can be connected to ongoing collective experiences, or what I like to call the hyper accumulation of experiences. And racial stress and trauma can be interpersonal, it can be vicarious or witnessed. For example, the young lady that was taping the incident with George Floyd, or what we witnessed on the 6th last week. It can also be connected with systemic experiences as well as collective experiences as well. And these events are humiliating, they are shaming, and they are dehumanizing. And so it's so important, again, that as providers, we are addressing racial stress and trauma along with all of the other categories of ACEs when we're working with children, youth, and families. So these are some of the symptoms of racial stress and trauma. Rumination, so those intrusive thoughts about the negative experience or the incident of racial discrimination, or those ongoing collective experiences of racial discrimination. Avoidance, avoiding to think about that traumatic incident. Negative mood and cognitions, increased vigilance and suspicion, so being on guard. Also, increased narrowing sense of time, thinking that you don't have long to live, that your time is limited here. Increased aggression, increased substance use, and racial stress and trauma can also lead to depression and suicidal ideation as well. So this is one of the models that's used to conceptualize racial stress and trauma in youth and in families. And so this model was developed by Celine Anderson and Williams. And the model helps us to understand that racial stress and trauma occurs within the context of the family, of the community, of religion, of culture, the socio-political history of our country, of racism, and within the community in which families and youth live, work, play, and pray. And so some of the symptoms here are described, with which we just addressed. We're experiencing intrusion, avoidance, negative mood and cognitions, and psychological arousal as well. So here are some healing-centered approaches in terms of addressing racial stress and trauma. Some of these approaches focus on relationships between the caregiver, the parent, and the child, a concept called racial socialization. This is defined as the verbal and nonverbal messages that families use to communicate race to their children. And so this can be seen as a cultural strength and has been associated with positive outcomes in African-American youth. And so one of the models that's used in terms of racial socialization is the racial encounter coping appraisal and socialization theory, or the recast theory, and that was developed by Anderson and Stevenson. And so this model attends to, really defining or appraising the racial discriminatory incident. It's about assessing one's coping ability to deal with that racial incident, and then supports and coping strategies in terms of dealing with the stressor. So that's one healing-centered approach. There's also the embrace model, the engaging, managing, and bonding through race model, also developed by Dr. Anderson, McKinney, and Stevenson. And so again, this model focuses on racial socialization and intervention to help parents in terms of having conversations with their youth around coping with racial discrimination. So do I want to go and protest peacefully? Do I want to write a letter? Do I want to start a social media campaign focused on human rights? So again, these interventions are focused on the parent-child relationship. And then there are also other approaches, self-care and community healing circles. The Association of Black Psychologists has partnered with the Community Healing Network in terms of offering emotional emancipation circles. And these are self-help support groups in which people of color work to heal from the lies of white superiority. It's an opportunity to share narratives about racial experiences. It's an opportunity to negate internalized racism. It's an opportunity to focus on liberation and also in forming relationships and support networks within one's community. And then there's also the work of Dr. Kenneth Hardy with healing the wounds of racial trauma in youth. And so Dr. Hardy emphasizes how racial stress and trauma creates a sense of voicelessness among youth of color, de-evaluation of youth of color. And so it's important as providers that we are affirming and acknowledging that race is an organizing principle in our society. He also mentions the importance of creating space for race, space for racial storytelling, and validation for youth to understand and cultivate their strengths. And so that's also an approach to addressing racial stress and trauma. There are some assessment tools. Of course, there is the cultural formulation interview that is with the DSM-5, as well as the Yukon Racial Stress Inventory survey are also used as tools to assess for racial stress and trauma. Yes, so as we think about our roles as providers, in working with young people and families that experience racial stress and trauma, it's also important that we are actively pursuing anti-racism. And so what do we mean by anti-racism? It's an active commitment to dismantle structures that perpetuate racial hierarchy. And there must be intentionality about this work. And so silence and inaction are acts of complicity. So it requires that we're examining the power imbalances between people of color and non-racialized or white people. It requires that we are active and consistent in our process of change to eliminate individual, institutional, and systemic racism. So I'd like to just share a local example of addressing systemic inequities through some of my work with the Jacksonville System of Care Initiative. So early on in my system of care career, and system of care is an approach to providing care that is coordinated, across various systems. And our system of care was focused on all systems, so foster care system, juvenile justice system, the educational system, as well as the behavioral health system. And so our work in terms of the juvenile justice system was focused on examining disparities and equities that we were seeing in terms of disproportionate minority contact in youth. And so our focus was on our diversion, and diversion is an alternative to arrest. It connects you to needed services, and it also holds you accountable. There were several policies that were implemented in our state around diversion and civil citations, particularly for youth that were involved with the misdemeanors. And so you see the history here, the legislative history here. And so one of our first steps in terms of addressing the inequities that we were seeing between our Black youth and our white youth in our community in terms of arrest was mapping the system. And so that's an important step in terms of addressing disparities, structural disparities, is looking at where possibly could bias be introduced. And so we mapped our system, and we started from the very beginning, from the initial contact with the police officer, with law enforcement, and the youth. And so we saw major disparities in terms of who was receiving citations and who was not. When we disaggregated our data based on race, based on zip code, based on gender, we saw major differences. We saw disparities. And so this chart here just shows you a snapshot from 2015. And you can see here that everyone who was eligible was not receiving civil citations. Could that be related to education of the officers, or could it be bias, or could it be a process or procedural issue? Regardless, it was an issue that needed to be addressed. And so we initiated training around bias with law enforcement. We initiated training around what is a civil citation, who's eligible for civil citations. And we also implemented some process changes as well in our community so that we saw more equity in terms of who was receiving civil citations. So again, this shows data, and it shows again some of the disparities that we saw in terms of African-American males and white males, as well as disparities between white females and Black females. So same level in terms of misdemeanor, same history, but differences in terms of who was receiving civil citations. And these are some of the offenses that fall under civil citations in terms of misdemeanors. So larceny, trespassing. So we're not talking about murders or felonies. We're talking about misdemeanors that youth were involved in. And so these are some of the action steps that were taken in terms of disparities reduction. And so one of the process changes was requirement to provide in writing the reason if not issuing a civil citation. So this was really important because a lot of times there are missteps or there's a misunderstanding about why one youth may have received a civil citation, another did not. So there was a systematic process put into place so that if a youth who was eligible did not receive a civil citation, then there was a red flag. That supervisor within law enforcement would address it. And again, that lowered the disparities that we saw in terms of who was receiving citations. We also expanded the eligibility for up to 3 misdemeanors. And there was a focus on data monitoring gathering using the Department of Juvenile Justice Prevention Assessment tool. And then there were also some additional legislations that were passed and memorandums of understandings that were put into place to make sure that these new processes were executed seamlessly. Right? And so it's important to understand that this work required collaboration across many systems. So again, across our behavioral health system, our educational system in terms of who was being referred to law enforcement, you know, in terms of of course, our juvenile justice system, our foster care system, and crossover youth, right? So, and then also in terms of youth and families being a part of the conversation as well. So this was important work in terms of making sure that there was inclusion in terms of diverse voices, in terms of families, youth, and also systems partners. So we have a poll here that we'd like for you to participate in. We'd like to know more about what your equity committees are doing within your systems or within your organization. So does your behavioral health community have an active, diverse, and inclusive behavioral health equity committee? Hey, Allison, I'm seeing the poll. Are there responses?
Yes, we are almost done. It looks like halfway through.
All right, so our results show that 40% of you said yes, you have active, diverse, and inclusive behavioral health equity committees, and 43% of you said you do not. And then maybe 16% of you said that you're in the process of creating a behavioral health committee. All right. Thank you. So the reason why we wanted to include that question is because this is really where the work happens, right? So it's within your committees, right? And so you can see here that we had youth from a local high school that were involved. There was an EVAC movement group. There also was an At Hope Youth Advisory group that was part of this work. Parents, caregivers also contributed to the discussion. There were several focus groups that were conducted to understand the lived experiences of youth that were involved with the juvenile justice system. There were judges, there were prosecutors, there were public defenders, there were probation officers. And so it really was the collaborative efforts across all systems, right? Because we know that these systems are connected in terms of addressing the needs of children with juvenile justice involvement. And of course, the behavioral health system was an important part of this work because, you know, it was important to conduct trauma assessments and to link young people to behavioral health services through our system of care. And so, so this is an example of the work of addressing inequities. So examining data, mapping systems, the collaboration that's involved across systems in terms of addressing inequities. Another important component was just the philosophy, right? The values that were being shared across these agencies. And so we had to reframe the way that we thought about youth that had participated in misdemeanors, right? So restorative justice, which is an approach to problem solving based on these three basic concepts. So the focus is on rebuilding relationships between the victim and the youth. It's also about obligations and liabilities and accountability. A lot of times when people hear restorative justice, they think it's just a slap on the hand, but there is accountability measures that are an important part of this work as well. And it's about healing the harms and putting things right. And so part of the work with the civil citation program and the diversion program was working with faith-based communities and with our schools in terms of hosting these conferencing meetings with young people and their victims to talk about ways to build bridges and ways to bring forth healing. And so, there was a paradigm shift that needed to occur. So the traditional paradigm, the more punitive paradigm was what was broken. The restorative paradigm was what harm occurred and how has that impacted relationships between the victim and the youth that's involved and their family. Who broke it? The traditional paradigm, what needs and obligations are needed from that harm. So is there, behavioral health services that are needed as a result, right? What is needed to build that relationship there, and how do we punish them? So again, moving from a more punitive paradigm to a more restorative and healing focused paradigm. So in conclusion, we are in a time in our nation where, we are facing so much in terms of racism, in terms of structural inequities. And so many of us are asking, particularly leaders within organizations and even direct service staff, we're asking, what can we do to create organizations that are more healing focused, that are more trauma informed. And what we see here in this particular diagram is that we really need to move away from being reactive. I can't tell you the number of calls I got after the George Floyd incident, when really a lot of this work should have been happening all along, right? And it's now everyone has this sense of urgency, and there's this greater sense of intentionality now that our nation is in a state of chaos, right? And so it's moving beyond being reactive and this us versus them mentality, and moving more towards a more reflective organization and making meaning out of our lived experiences. And it's also about accountability. So really not accepting the data, not accepting that this is the way it's supposed to be in terms of disparities, but questioning and with intentionality addressing and implementing strategies to reduce those disparities. And relational leadership, right? So really humanizing the people who are doing the work, and also humanizing children, youth, and families who are experiencing all forms of trauma in terms of racial stress and trauma. And so, I'd just like to end with one of my favorite quotes by Dr. Martin Luther King. I think his picture is behind me. We are caught in this inescapable network of a single garment of destiny. And so whatever affects one affects us all. And so the importance of humanizing the experiences that our children, youth, and families are facing is critical during this time. I'll turn it over to Linda.
Thanks, Selena. We had, that was a great presentation. We have a number of questions in the chat that focus on some of the information that you presented. So one that kind of builds off of this one, which isn't the first one, but I wanted to pose to you and see if you could respond to is it important to expose the truth of these systems in relation to criminalization, addiction, breaking of the foundation of cultural pride in order to move toward healing within the cultural context? It seems there's a need to heal the culture as a whole as well as individuals.
Absolutely. So, I think there has to be one acknowledgement of historical atrocities that have occurred in our nation. So yes, there has to be that acknowledgement, both for the larger society and also for at the individual level as well. So absolutely. In terms of the healing component, yeah, so I think we all have a part in that, and I think before we can do the work of healing others, my grandmother would say you can't pour from an empty cup. Before we begin the work of healing others, we have to begin healing within ourselves. And so absolutely humanizing the experiences of those that are doing the work and those who are experiencing the work is critical.
Agreed. The second question, which was actually the first question, is there space in this racial trauma lens for how allies and accomplices may experience vicarious trauma? Feelings such as anger, sadness, despair that come up as we witness these things happening and are trying to do anti-racist work, not as a way to center ourselves, but recognizing in ourselves that there is an impact as we try to do this work.
So absolutely, I think that we're all experiencing grief on some level. You know, we specifically emphasize the grief of African Americans and people of color in this presentation. You know, absolutely, allies are experiencing grief as well. And so I think it's important for allies to use their privilege to help dismantle these systems, to speak up in terms of, you know, when inequities are occurring, or when, you know, there are situations within the organization or interpersonal situations that, you know, that we are deliberate and intentional about addressing those issues. But absolutely, I think there is grief, and we're kind of all going through those stages of grief on, you know, from the ally perspective, or an ally can be a person who's not of color, as well as for individuals who are of color as well.
I agree, and I don't have the citation handy, but I will find it and make it available. But there is recent research that shows just how difficult it is to speak up, and that shows that people are not likely to do so even when they have the opportunity to. So this is really an area that we really should concentrate on in terms of making that work possible on the part of individuals, because it is difficult, right?
Yes, because there can be consequences for speaking up.
Correct.
And so this is the work of anti-racism, you know, particularly leaders, in terms of creating an organizational culture that does not punish for speaking one's truth. And so I think that's important in terms of leaders creating environments. That's what we mean by creating space to talk about race, spaces that are gracious, and spaces that allow for courageous conversations.
Yes. One more question we had related to the juvenile diversion slides. How do diverse committees like this ensure that racism doesn't influence decisions and recommendations made by the committee?
Yes, I think there was lots of transparency in the discussions. You know, the leader of the committee was actually an African-American CEO of a behavioral health organization back in 2015, in terms of the racial ethnic disparity, what we call the RED committee. And so I think there was a level of accountability and consensus among the group that we were not going to leave the race word outside of the conversation, that we weren't just going to pretend that this is just data and this is just what's expected. That there was truly intentionality about examining that data, thinking about contributing factors, thinking about social determinants of health, thinking about root causes in terms of traumatic experiences, and going beyond just the surface work that had been done in the past. So, so leadership is so important in terms of setting tones in meetings, and in terms of creating the culture for the work to occur in a way that we are dismantling inequity.
If I could add just one thing, I would say also that this work is continuous, right? We don't create a committee and then it gets taken care of forever. As we can see, given, you know, the example that you opened with what's happening in the country there, we have to continue this work continuously. Make sure, you know, that we're seeing things as they are happening and then responding to them. So I think that's the other piece of it, is to really focus on the fact that this is continuous and continual work, unfortunately.
Yes.
We have one more question here. As a white person, how do I lead these discussions at my organization without sounding patronizing to the women of color I work with?
Yeah. So, great question.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to, one, acknowledge your own vulnerability. Oftentimes we want to come in as if we are the experts. You know, we've read the book on how to be an anti-racist, and we've read White Fragility, and we've read this. And so we come in thinking that, okay, I'm ready. I think there has to be this level of vulnerability that, and cultural humility, where I don't know everything there is to know. I'm here to center voices. I'm here to bring voices that have traditionally been excluded from the conversation, to bring them to the center. And so I think when you use that approach, it creates an environment that's more gracious, an environment that allows for more genuine and authentic conversations.
Thanks, Selena. Do we have any other questions?
We had just more of a technical one that popped up. If you could please explain what civil citation means for those folks who are not involved in the JJ system.
Yeah, so a civil citation is offered to a youth who may have committed, I don't want to say committed, that's not a good word, that may have been involved with a misdemeanor, right? And so instead of being arrested, they are diverted to a program. And so that program allows for restorative work. They have volunteer hours they must do. They are linked with the behavioral health system in terms of conducting a trauma assessment and so forth. So a civil citation is an opportunity to divert youth from entering the juvenile justice system and, basically following that trajectory of becoming an adult criminal. So it's a way of, helping youth to become more productive by, providing life skills, support, mentorship, again, doing work with restorative circles within the community and so forth. So it's a way to avoid a record for young people.
Great, thanks, Selena. And one more question just popped up. I think this might be for Linda's slides, actually. Someone noticed that some of the slides had footnotes that say the difference is significant at a 5% level, but not all. And the participants asking, what is the standard approach regarding statistical tests in this area?
Yes, and I had actually made note of that comment, but the chat was moving very quickly. There isn't really a standard approach, I want to say, and I'm not a statistician, but I think it's going to depend on the study and what it is they're measuring and how they're measuring. So that's the best I can give you. I don't think that, depending on the statistical test, the significance level is going to be determined based on the number of people in the study.
Great, thanks, Linda.
So I hope that helps. And those were all taken, those slides were taken from, reports, generally speaking, that are, they're not studies per se of youth or young adults using particular interventions, but really more like from national surveys.
Great, thank you. And just to remind participants, all of the materials will be made available. So if folks want to dig into some of those resources that were provided and some of the things that were cited, they can certainly do that too. Just before we close out here, Linda, Selena, do you have any last thoughts for the group?
I just want to mention that we do have resources that are part of the PowerPoint. And so resources specific on some of the data that Linda shared, as well as racial stress and trauma resources, as well as some of the healing approaches. There are links to the studies, as well as some of the emotional emancipation circles, and also Dr. Hardy's work, Healing the Wounds of Racial Trauma. So if you'd like to, have more in-depth information in terms of those topics, those resources are at the end of the PowerPoint. And thank you so much for your participation today and being a part.
Yes, I was going to say the same thing. We have resources and the references that we, the citations that we had in our slides. Really thankful to have had the opportunity to talk with you all about this really important topic, and we hope that we can continue this conversation, offline. We have, I think, our contact information here. Feel free to get in touch with us and continue the conversation.
Great. Well, I just want to thank the both of you for your time and your thoughts and wisdom. Thank you so much for presenting for us today. And thank you to everyone who stayed with us and dropped into today's session. Just as a reminder for everyone, this is just the first of many Training Institute sessions. They will be held the first Thursday of every month through August. And the next session is February 4th. So there is a link in the chat to go ahead and follow and register for future sessions or for the February 4th session. So please do. And we appreciate you joining us today. And we hope to see you again on February 4th. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.